Hello. We're continuing our series on the fruit of the Spirit today. And I'm going to spend the next few minutes looking at the last fruits that Paul lists in Galatians, the fruit of self-control. I wonder what comes to your mind when you hear that term. I know for me, I immediately think of those areas of life where perhaps I sometimes struggle to show self-control. Unhealthy foods sometimes, well, maybe quite often, I struggle to control myself around. There are sometimes days where I struggle to control how I use my time in the best way possible. I'm sure for many of us, we can think of moments, maybe even over this past week, where we've lost control of our emotions. We've lost control of feelings like anger and fear, and then had to live with the consequences. Do you know the word in the New Testament for self-control, the word that Paul uses in Galatians, is the word egrateia, which is probably a word I've mispronounced, but it means the virtue of one who masters his desires and passions. And you know, I think this virtue of being someone who has their desires and passions mastered is actually a very valued thing in society at the moment. If you go to, say, a newsagent, you will see rows of magazines with diets and eating plans showing you how to master the desires of your appetite. If you go on YouTube or if you go to a bookstore, you'll see all manner of people who have written and spoke on how we can master our thoughts, how we can master our careers. And indeed, the media is often filled with stories of celebrities who have had moments where they've lacked self-control. They've lacked self-control perhaps in relationships or with substances, and then had to live with the negative consequences. But actually what I find most interesting about this word, particularly the way it's used in the New Testament, is not so much the word itself, because I think probably most people would agree it's a good trait to have, but actually where it's used. Do you know, in the New Testament, that word egrateia is used 3 times. The first time is in the book of Acts. And it comes towards the end of Acts, in Acts chapter 24, where Paul, one of the lead church planters in the early life of the church, is being persecuted for his faith. And he's on trial in front of one of the Roman rulers, Felix. And at that moment of persecution and trial, we're told he speaks to Felix of 3 things. He speaks of righteousness, of judgment, and of self-control. The second time that it's used is in what we have been looking at in this short series in the book of Galatians, where Paul lists it as one of the fruits of the Spirit. But what's interesting is that whilst we've been focusing just on these 2 verses by themselves, actually the whole of the book of Revelation can actually be read as Paul's letter to a divided church. A church where there is a schism between those who are Christians of a Jewish background and those who aren't. And actually a lot of what Paul says in the book of Galatians can be read as him trying to bring a sense of unity where there is division. And so when he writes the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, so on, to self-control, he is writing it perhaps specifically as a way to bring people together. And the fact that self-control is the last fruit perhaps implies a great importance to it. And the last place it's used is in 2 Peter, where as Peter opens this letter, he says, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, to goodness knowledge, and to knowledge self-control. And again, what's interesting here is that across a lot of the rest of Peter's letter, he writes about the dangers of false teaching, of people who will seek to deceive you. And so my point is that it's quite interesting to think that where it's used in the Bible, whereas when I think of self-control, I might think about eating too much chocolate or losing my temper. Actually, in the New Testament, the word is used in terms of when we encounter danger. And whether it's the danger that Paul was facing when he was being persecuted and put on trial, whether it was the danger of division in a church in Galatia, or whether it was the danger of false and deceptive teaching, the call on us is to be people who show self-control. Do you know this word egrateia, I found out this week, is actually related to another Greek word, kratos, which means strength. And it's interesting, do you know, when I often encounter dangers or difficulties in life, what I want, what I desire is to see God's strength. I want to see God's strength in answering prayers. I want to see God's strength in maybe performing miracles or changing people's minds. And whilst it's obviously good to desire and seek those things, actually there's a strong call across the Bible that when we encounter danger, we are to be people of strength. You might think of the opening of Joshua, where Joshua has been given this enormous task of leading God's people towards the promised land. And across even just the opening first chapter, 4 times, God gives him the same command. He says, be strong and courageous. 4 times. Be strong and courageous. I heard a talk this week from a well-known American preacher. And he said that in Christian leadership, whether you're a pastor, whether you're a ministry leader, whether you're involved in a home group, whatever kind of leadership you're involved in as a Christian, the number one challenge you will face is fear. And so it's striking that in each of those moments where we saw that word self-control used in persecution, in deception, and in division, self-control was the antidote to the fear that it might create. Which I guess begs the question, how do we find this strength to be self-controlled, as Paul calls us to? Well, thankfully, as this short passage in Galatians comes to an end, Paul gives us, I think, a glimpse of the answer. In Galatians 5:25, after giving a list of the fruit of the Spirit, he says, so since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. In a sense, I think he's saying, let us keep in step with the one who is the source of the fruit. If we're going to be people who love, if we're going to be people who are kind, if we're going to be people who are strong and have the self-control to keep following God in the face of trials and difficulties, we need to stay close to God himself. And so I'm just going to pray some of that over us as we finish. So I don't know what dangers you're aware of at this moment. Perhaps you're aware of the dangers of the coronavirus. Perhaps you're aware of the dangers of maybe your job prospects or your finances or your family relationships. But whatever we face at this time, let's draw close. God, draw us close to you, the source, the fount of true strength. Amen.